When someone suffering from a psychological ailment interacts with a therapist with the goal of relieving that ailment, therapy happens. It comes in all shapes and sizes. There are currently over 400 different systems of psychotherapy. But one family of practices, the psychodynamic approach, has its roots in the Freudian tradition of psychoanalysis, which encourage people to explore their childhood memories and by doing so develop insight into their psychological difficulties.
Psychodynamic is a broad term, and it includes things like psychoanalysis and a whole variety of different offshoots that have developed over the last century.
The hallmarks of psychoanalysis are several techniques used by the analyst to help their client develop insight into their problems. These include free association, dream analysis, interpretations of thoughts and actions, and analysis of resistance to psychological treatment.
What happens in therapy, the reason why psychodynamic therapy would help them, is because the therapist, in a sense, is exploring the architecture of that unconscious. And they're trying to figure out what sorts of things have happened during the person's development, what's stored in networks of implicit memory that are resulting in symptomatology. So the unconscious, in a sense, rests in our evolutionary history, our developmental history as individuals, and also in our traumatic history, because a lot of trauma is stored in networks of memory that are unconscious. And some of Freud's techniques were free association, for example. He would ask someone to say a word, and he'd say, well, what does that remind you of? And he would just have them continue. And it's not linear, it's not rational. It's associative. It's this more of like a network or a spider web of associations as opposed to a linear track based on language. Freud felt that dreams had specific or particular meanings for people.
There are several distinctive features of Freud's version of therapy.
Well, probably the most distinctive two things would be that the client's lying down on some kind of a couch. And the second distinctive thing is that Freud would sit behind his clients.
Psychodynamic therapies now include a range of therapy techniques that have grown from the core concepts of Freud's system, but have gradually been refined and realigned. For example, therapists now are less likely to interpret a client's statement as a sign of unconscious sexual or aggressive impulses.
And what does this mean to you? I don't know. I get this sort of feeling that you're the type of person who needs to keep active. If you don't keep active, something goes wrong. Is this true?
Yes.
You see, you've established a pattern, haven't you?
Around the middle of the 20th century, there was a gathering sentiment among therapists that the psychodynamic approach at times holds an overly negative view of the human condition. Humanistic therapies came to be based on the idea that human nature is generally positive and that each of us has a deep desire to strive for personal improvement. Humanistic therapies involve the therapist striving to be genuine, empathetic, and accepting.
Well, humanistic therapy has a different starting point. We're not thinking about the evolutionary Darwinian past and the deep history of the brain. We're really thinking in terms of human experience, the phenomenological experience of the client.
So this guy that you went to town with really said you're no good? Is that what you're telling me?
In humanistic therapies, the therapist and the client usually sit facing one another, and the therapist strives to be genuinely tuned in and accepting of the client.
And what does he think of you? He thinks you're no good. And that really knocked you for a loop.
I don't care, though.
You tell yourself you don't care. But some part of you does care because some part of you is upset by it.
People need to have meaning in their lives, or their lives have to have a meaning. And so this whole search for meaning, I think, is sort of key with humanistic therapy.
Well, now we turn our attention to humanistic therapies. And one of the things to keep in mind when we're examining this is that humanistic therapies really did believe in human potential. The one thing that they had in common with the psychoanalytic approach was the centrality of insight. They were of the same opinion, essentially, as the psychodynamic folks were, and that was that as insight was developed, then change could then develop. So they're both considered insight therapies, and essentially the focal point for each of these was to improve psychological functioning by increasing a person's awareness of their underlying motives and defenses. So to put it in shorthand, increase psychological awareness or functioning, I'm sorry. So increase psychological functioning by increasing awareness, and that really is the formula, in a sense, for both psychodynamic and humanistic therapies. As we increase psychological functioning, and this naturally leads to an increase, the awareness is increased, which then leads to psychological functioning. So in some cases, in some respects, this arrow is bidirectional. Awareness increases functioning, and functioning increases awareness, and so you have kind of this mutually interactive circle or impacting circle. However, in contrast to psychodynamic ways of looking at things, humanistic therapists focus on the present, and this is one of the key features for humanistic therapies. So they focus on the present and not the past. Sometimes they see the past and the psychodynamic approach as being overly deterministic. What that means is that if we can figure out the past, and we can break through to changing things in the present, and by doing so, then the assumption is that the history determines the present and the future, and therefore then it's kind of a closed system in some respects. So they focus on the future more than the past. They focus on conscious feelings rather than unconscious feelings. Of course, Freud and psychodynamic approaches emphasize a lot of what is not known by the client themselves, and they focus a lot more, and I'll just put an up arrow, more on the future as a motivating force for change. They see the future more than the past in the client's conscious feelings. And the last one is a commitment to taking responsibility for one's own growth. And that's what you will find if you've been in counseling before, or in a lot of counseling contexts. The emphasis on responsibility rather than deflecting it onto someone else, is a hallmark of the humanistic perspective. So essentially their goal here is to promote growth rather than to cure illness. And so it is, like I said, in most counseling contexts, humanistic therapy, specifically Rogers, who's pictured here, emphasis is how do we promote growth rather than curing something that has been called a sickness or an illness. And that is a hallmark, I would say, of a lot of the humanistic therapies that have impacted any kind of counseling that you probably have come into contact with. Most people in this perspective would say labeling somebody as ill actually limits their capacity to grow, because they begin to define themselves by their illness itself. Now, the giant in this area is a guy by the name of Carl Rogers, who's, like I said, is pictured below. He spent more time than most anybody in developing what he called a non-directive client-centered therapy. Non-directive and client-centered. The assumption here is that the person is the expert on their own issues. Client-centered therapy. They are an expert on their own issues, which is very opposite of psychodynamic thought that says they are not the expert. Actually, who they are approaching is the expert. And so essentially they are going to the expert in order to find out what's wrong with them. And Rogers advocated active listening, which usually included reflection or paraphrasing or just listening intently, being able to track the person from their point of view, not our own. The three key characteristics that he identified to relationship, which is true with most anybody really, is genuineness. Genuineness. My E looks awful. So genuineness, acceptance, otherwise known as unconditional positive regard, is the term that Rogers actually used, and unconditional positive regard, and that has gotten shortened to acceptance. And interestingly enough, in a lot of ways, these values are also scriptural. We're admonished in Scripture to be who we really are, not be something that we're not. Of course, the Pharisees took it hard on the chin because they tried to create an appearance of religiosity rather than live it. So genuineness and accepting others as fellow journeyers, if you will, and then empathy. And empathy differs from sympathy, and the way to conceptualize this is sympathy is feeling with somebody. If whatever they feel, you feel with them. Empathy, on the other hand, is feeling in such a way that we can see the world through their eyes, but it is not taking on the same feelings as that person. So I have this capacity to walk in their shoes and be able to see the world and be able to communicate it to them, that I understand it in this respect. These three values were what Rogers called necessary. So they have to be present. And then the other word was sufficient that he used. And again, these are things that probably are not in your book. I'm pretty sure they're not, as a matter of fact. But he called them the necessary and sufficient conditions for relationship. And he never, I shouldn't say never, but he often thought in terms of relationship amongst people rather than therapeutic relationships. Now, clearly, people who are acting therapeutically are not necessarily going to be a friend. But at the same time, he wanted to explore what are the key conditions to a growing, healthy relationship. And these three keys are part of what he referred to the most. So he believed that these conditions and the technique of listening would help clients to increase their self-awareness and self-acceptance. And the therapist interrupts only to restate and confirm the client's feelings, to accept what the client is expressing, or to seek clarification. So that's why we get this word client-centered. It has now been changed to person-centered. And essentially, from Roger's point of view, if we could move the obstacles to growth, then the person would naturally grow in positive directions. And that was one of those places where where Rogers, who grew up as a minister's kid, his dad was a Methodist minister, but in a lot of ways, because of the humanistic perspective, he believed that the ground of truth, in a sense, and he was defining, in this case, absolute truth, was to be found within the person rather than in some external deity, and that was really the hallmark of a lot of humanistic therapies.